All right, it looks like we're on. So, Randall, thanks for coming on for a second time, a second conversation. I really appreciate it. Last time we talked a lot about the general arguments for the existence of God, and today I wanted to present to you my general epistemology that I'm working on to write it into a book. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on my model, because essentially, my model essentially takes the position that it's not even potentially possible to have evidence or arguments that could indicate a God. And I'd like to present to you why that is the case and to hear your thoughts on it. So, first question, did you get a chance to look up the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's definition of naturalistic pantheism since the last time we talked?
No, I haven't.
All right, so just I wrote it down, luckily.
Okay.
So in the section on pantheism, in section number 6, the nature of the cosmos, the first one is parentheses 1, physicalism. Many pantheists argue that the physical conceptions are adequate to explain the entire cosmos, often termed scientific or naturalistic pantheism. Such worldviews make no ontological commitments beyond those sanctioned by empirical science. And the section 12, personal, Einstein was a pantheist but rejected any notion of a personal God, and like Einstein, for many pantheists, rejection of a personal deity is the definitive mark or most important element of their position. So naturalistic pantheism is essentially just naturalism, but it's kind of like a natural God kind of thing, but without the personal part, the consciousness part.
So when you say natural, how do you define natural?
I have no real way to define the distinction between natural and supernatural. Is kind of an arbitrary distinction. I have no way to parse that at all.
So when you say everything is natural, what are you even saying then?
I don't know. It's not really a specific thing. It's just trying to make a distinction, a broad distinction between the ideas of a natural scientific worldview and a theistic kind of a worldview. So it's more just a general distinction to try and distinguish those two more than anything.
So if we're distinguishing them, we should be able to say in virtue of what is something natural versus non-natural. So what would that distinction be?
Well, my general idea would be essentially if there's a kind of a consciousness that isn't based in any physical thing, then I would classify that as kind of a supernatural thing. But that's just arbitrary definition I'm slapping on it.
Okay, so the distinction, let's say for something to be natural, would be for it ultimately in its most basic metaphysical composition to be non-conscious.
Or just matter and energy and motion or something like that.
Okay, because the matter and energy and motion, the challenge there is we're already assuming a particular understanding of those concepts, which could very well be rendered redundant in future scientific investigation. And if science told us, well, the world is composed of something other than that which we currently understand to be matter and energy, would we have thereby falsified naturalism?
Right. So there could also be more fundamental things, but as long as they're not like a supernatural consciousness, I'd still classify it as natural.
Though you just said you're not clear as what supernatural is.
Oh, right. As long as it's not like a consciousness that isn't purely material functioning, then yeah.
Okay.
All right, so to begin, I affirm something kind of like Kant's noumenal-phenomenal distinction, where the phenomenal world is the thing we experience and interact with, and the noumenal is reality in itself. And the phenomenal and noumenal could be the exact same thing, or they could be completely different. For example, we could be in the Matrix, and the things we experience have no correlation to reality, but we have no way to know one way or the other because everything we experience is the phenomenal, and we have no way to go outside of our experiences to access reality itself. So if someone is making claims about the noumenal world, they would need some kind of noumenal evidence, because no matter how much phenomenal evidence they provide, that could just be a product of the Matrix, and so it doesn't support claims about the noumenal world. And so noumenal claims would require noumenal evidence. And what's unique about my model is that I expand on the idea of the noumenal and what constitutes a noumenal claim. For example, I take the position, the metaphysical naturalism, the position metaphysical naturalism, which states that there is only the natural and there is no supernatural. Even if given all of the evidence of the natural world, that does not show that there is no supernatural, because there could always be more supernatural out there that we just haven't discovered yet. And so if you consider the question, well, what kind of evidence could be discovered to justify the claim the natural world is all there is? Well, there really isn't any that could justify that kind of a claim, because anything that it would take to justify it would have to go infinitely far into the unknown to say that of all of this, we could never discover this other kind of a thing. And we just don't have that kind of justification with any of the access or any of the kinds of knowledge that we have. So nothing can really justify the claim there is only the natural world. And because of that claim, the metaphysical naturalism is a claim about the noumenal. And so none of the phenomenal evidence we have could justify the noumenal claim about metaphysical naturalism. And the reason is that the reason metaphysical naturalism is a noumenal claim is because it makes a claim of a stopping point for truth, meaning it makes a claim that extends infinitely far into the unknown and says there can't possibly be anything in this unknown that will overturn this statement of there is only the natural, and we clearly can't do that. So, but this kind of a claim also applies to properties of a God, like saying God is by definition not created, or to rephrase it, there is only one God and there is no like super God. That claim fails for the exact same reason metaphysical naturalism fails, which is that even if we had as much evidence for a God as we do for the natural world, that would not show that that God was not created by another greater God for the exact same reason. There could always be another greater God out there we just haven't discovered yet. And this would apply to all metaphysical or noumenal properties like God being all-powerful and all-knowing and all-loving and eternal and necessary, divine aseity, pure actuality, perfect simplicity, etc. There could always be another God out there that's more powerful or more knowledgeable or more simple or more good. And so all of these omni-necessary properties are essentially just words for a noumenal something. And because they're noumenal, no amount of phenomenal evidence that we have could ever justify belief in those kinds of noumenal properties, for the same reason we can't justify belief in metaphysical naturalism. So essentially, the main argument goes something like all forms of human knowledge are phenomenal, God is noumenal, no amount of human knowledge can indicate the existence of a God. And of course, this doesn't just apply to a God, it applies to all noumenal claims like metaphysical naturalism or any kind of metaphysical claim about the fundamental nature of reality. So essentially, I'm not arguing that there isn't a God, I'm arguing that we should dismiss all noumenal claims about the fundamental nature of reality, top-down worldviews, and build our understanding of reality making claims from the phenomenal or the bottom-up worldviews. And that's essentially the main conclusion of my epistemology, but it goes a bit further because I say we can demonstrate this is the case, that for any given argument or evidence for the existence of a God, we can demonstrate they don't work. For example, if we have a box and you said that there was a rabbit in the box, but your evidence for this is that the box weighs 2 pounds. The fact the box weighs 2 pounds is not evidence of a rabbit because it can be equally explained by a lizard or a coffee mug or weights or Legos, etc. So the fact that the evidence works equally for numerous other options means it is not evidence of a rabbit. The same applies to evidence of a God. If I can show the same evidence or arguments individually and collectively, indicate a non-God equally as well as they do for a God, like pantheism or naturalistic pantheism as I define it, then they're not actually evidence of a God. So the box analogy is an example of a good argument that's simply underdetermined, but it's also possible that the argument is simply false. For example, if you have a compass that you think points north and every time you shake it, it points in a different random direction, it's a broken compass. It doesn't indicate any direction because it indicates every direction, which is an example of just false evidence, or the principle of explosion. From false to anything follows. Any argument that can work for both theism or naturalistic pantheism could be underdetermined or it could be false, but either way it works for both and isn't evidence of a God, so I'm not really going to focus on that too much about the arguments. The box analogy, like the evidence of the natural world, is evidence that all of the evidence of the natural world isn't evidence there is no supernatural. Equally, like all the evidence of if there was a God wouldn't be evidence there is not a greater God. All of these are examples of the problem of induction. The problem of induction and underdetermination, which are only two of the examples of dozens of equivalently big problems in every field of human knowledge, which essentially act as a barricade between the phenomenal and the noumenal. And so all of these problems that exist in every field of human knowledge essentially have the same effect and show that no form of human knowledge can go from the phenomenal to the noumenal, and they're all of the phenomenal realm. For example, in epistemology, you have problems like the problem of the criterion, Agrippa's trilemma, the problem of the universals, the problem of easy knowledge. In math, you have Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and logic, Tarski's undefinability theorem. Moral knowledge, the open question argument, and the fact-value distinction, which apply both to supernatural and natural sources. These same problems which prevent scientific and secular philosophy from making conclusions about the noumenal realm like metaphysical naturalism also prevent religious claims from being able to make conclusions about the noumenal realm, about a God. And because of these problems in secular philosophy, the questions that secular philosophy and science can't answer, theology can't answer either, but both can make up answers about what the noumenal could be like. For example, anything that supernatural can explain, the unknown natural can also explain. For example, objective morality could be explained by a God, but it could also be explained by an undiscovered law of nature that an atheist could just arbitrarily make up. So every known form of knowledge has these problems. They all apply to every worldview or every form of knowledge that we know of. And so any asserted evidence or arguments used to indicate a stopping point for truth will necessarily run into one of these problems, and whatever approach you take to try and address the problem will be able to be mirrored by the non-God alternatives, showing that the approach is not, in fact, evidence of a God. Therefore, if your explanation has any stopping points for truth, such as eternal, all-powerful, all-knowing, omnibenevolent, the only, divine aseity, pure actuality, perfectly simple, or a brute fact, or any of those things, then those can't be supported by any known form of human knowledge, and they're essentially just bald assertions, which can be demonstrated because the same bald assertions can be made about a naturalistic alternative like naturalistic pantheism. For example, many theists respond that when asked who created God, well, they say God could not have been created because he was by definition uncreated. And so this noumenal property of uncreated can be applied to the undiscovered natural thing and attributed to naturalistic pantheism. So I can just say naturalistic pantheism is by definition uncreated. So anytime you add these metaphysical properties, they're essentially de facto infinites. And so when you add them to an explanation, it allows you to do an infinite amount of ad hoc reasoning and gives them an infinite amount of explanatory power, or it makes it appear that they have an infinite amount of explanatory power when they really have none, because the same methods work for everything. A bridge of infinite length can cross any chasm. And this, again, can be demonstrated by just giving these, asserting these properties about the alternatives to theism, which can show that they're not actually evidence of theism. So that is essentially the short version, the synopsis of it. So what are your thoughts?
Well, covered a lot of ground there. Why don't we back up and go to Kant? So you introduced these terms, the phenomenal realm and the noumenal realm. Would you be okay if we simply substituted the reality as we understand it for phenomenal realm and reality as it is for noumenal realm?
Yeah.
Okay, because I'm a fan of not using more specialist terminology than is required. And so I think it's for our conversation, it's probably clearer if we just say how we understand reality to be and how it in fact is. So with then that in mind, am I to understand that you are arguing for a universal skepticism about all of our beliefs, that we can't know that we have knowledge of anything? Is that succinctly, is that what you're claiming?
Well, I'd say we can't have absolute knowledge. We can still have knowledge contextualized. For example, I can say, it appears to me that I am holding a cup. Now, that would be knowledge which is true regardless of whatever the fundamental nature of reality is, because my perceptions don't necessarily need to cohere to the fundamental nature of reality. And I'm only making the statement about my perceptions.
But you are, how do you define absolute knowledge? You said we can't have absolute knowledge.
About like the fundamental nature of reality. Like I can't say that I am definitely holding a cup because I could be in the Matrix. And so the cup may not exist. It could be false that I'm holding a cup, but I can still.
So absolute knowledge, you define it as indefeasible knowledge?
That would be one.
Or incorrigible, in other words, incorrigible or indefeasible, meaning you could not be wrong about this.
Right, that would be one form of metaphysical knowledge. But I would say metaphysical knowledge would be just any fact that that we can know with that level of certainty is true about the fundamental nature of reality. So any fact itself would, in fact, like I could say, either I am alive or I am not, either I exist or I do not exist. That would technically be a metaphysical truth, but we don't know which one of those is in fact corresponding to reality.
Well, assuming you accept a law of excluded middle.
Right.
Yeah, see, so one of the things here is these days in epistemology, fallibilism is certainly the epistemology du jour, so that it's quite common, in fact, very common. It's sort of standard to say that insofar as we have knowledge as fallible and perspectival knowers, that we know from a particular angle. And so to set up the desire for absolute knowledge, the kind of knowledge that is indefeasible and incorrigible, that you could not be wrong about that knowledge, that is sort of a misbegotten project of a now widely recognized to have failed foundationalism. So, what you get back in people like Rene Descartes or maybe John Locke, and the modernist project to try to have a decontextualized knowledge that is certain and could never fail you. So today it's much more common to say we can have knowledge, but we have knowledge as fallible perspectival knowers. And for example, Michael Polanyi, a well-known mid-20th century philosopher of science, described it as personal knowledge, that it is knowledge that you have this knowledge. And now, of course, we've kind of set aside for the moment how to define knowledge itself, and we could perhaps come to that. But we can have knowledge knowing that we could be wrong about it. But nonetheless, you can still know something even though you could be wrong about it. So would you disagree with that we can have that fallible knowledge?
Oh, no, I totally agree with that. I completely agree. My contention would be that if you're making a claim about something that has like these noumenal properties of, by definition, not created, that would be something that would require the kind of absolute knowledge. And so those kinds of claims would be intrinsically unsupportable.
So what do you mean? Like, I thought that we had said, yeah, we'll, instead of using phenomenal and noumenal, we'll just go to reality as we understand it and reality as it is. And so if we're going to talk about reality as it is, what's wrong with me saying that as a fallible knower, I can have fallible knowledge, but knowledge nonetheless of reality as it is? That if I look out the window right now and see that it is sunny, then all things being equal, I am justified in believing it is sunny. And if it is indeed sunny, I can know that it is sunny. I don't see why there's a big problem there.
Right. I don't have any problem with that. My problem is that there's a contradiction when you say I can have fallible knowledge of some infallible property.
What do you mean by an infallible property?
Just a property that is absolute, like saying there is a God that which is by definition not created. That's kind of one of those properties that goes infinitely far into the unknown. And so you're saying you have fallible knowledge of this infinite property, or this infallible property, for lack of a better term.
Are you saying, when you say infallible property, you're meaning to refer to necessary beings?
Yes, the like all-powerful, all-knowing, non-created, divine aseity, pure actuality.
So for example,
labeling that is, you said fallible and infallible, so I'm just using those terms for right now. So I'm going to call that, that would be like infallible properties. And so we can't have fallible knowledge of those infallible properties. That's essentially what I'm arguing.
Yeah, I don't understand why you call those infallible properties. I mean, let's just set aside a rich theological framework and just ask this question. Can a person have fallible knowledge that there is an intelligence that created the universe, or that there's an intelligence that answers their prayers? Why not? You know, without packing into it a whole list of divine attributes drawn from classical theism, such as simplicity, omnibenevolence, omnipotence, omniscience, immutability, impassibility, etc. Setting aside all that, why can't a person simply have fallible knowledge that there is an intelligence that created the universe who responds to my prayers, or something like that?
That would be totally fine. There's no contradiction there. That would not be what I would classify as infallible knowledge.
Okay, so a person can have fallible, justified beliefs and perhaps knowledge of God, knowledge only if God in fact exists, at least to that extent.
Well, I'd say that you can have justified, fallible knowledge of something creating the universe and something responding to your prayers. That I'd be totally fine with that. But
created in the universe?
Created the universe and responds to your prayers.
Okay.
But you couldn't say that. I would not extend that to the claim that that thing could be not have been created. So you couldn't have fallible knowledge that that thing was not created by something else. You couldn't have fallible knowledge that that thing had infinitely power, was the most powerful, or there wasn't something more powerful, or that the thing had all knowledge and there wasn't something else it didn't know, or something more knowledgeable.
So let's say for the moment that we assume, so we have a person, and let's say there is this being that created the universe and intelligence, created the universe and answers their prayers, and they have fallible knowledge that that person created the universe and answers their prayers. Can that person have fallible knowledge that this individual has what is called strong immutability? So that, in other words, their core moral attributes at least don't ever change? Can they have knowledge of that?
I'm not sure. Like, you could say maybe it doesn't change, I guess, but you wouldn't be able to say it's like an objective morality, because you wouldn't be able to say that there wasn't something more moral, or there was a better moral standard that could be out there.
But I don't understand. That's fully consistent. The fact that you could be wrong about something is consistent with fallible knowledge. So why couldn't that person have knowledge, but as a fallible, perspectival knower, that this individual who created the universe and answers their prayers is also immutable in the sense that they will not change in their moral character?
Well, I'd be happy to grant that it won't change, but I would not grant that it's an objective basis, or it is the pinnacle of morality. I wouldn't grant that.
Well, I just said that they're strongly immutable.
Right.
But
So I wasn't exactly sure what you meant by that, so I was covering both my bases there.
Okay. So then let's consider another attribute. Could they believe that this individual who answers their prayers and created the universe is also all-knowing? Is that possible? They couldn't believe that.
No. That
Why
would be
not?
one of those. I see that as a contradiction to say that you have fallible knowledge of this infallible property of all knowing.
But I don't call why. I think it's just a mislabeling to call that an infallible property. The property is the property of knowing all true propositions and believing no false ones.
Right. To say that there is something that knows everything and that there isn't something else that knows more or something that it doesn't know, I would consider that. And the word I'm using infallible just because it's the word you used at the beginning of the conversation, just to create a distinction there. So it isn't like a technical term I'm using here. I'm just trying to use that as a distinction. So, but if you're trying to say that there is this thing that has absolute knowledge and there isn't something it doesn't know, or there isn't something that knows more than it, that would be one of those kinds of infallible absolute claims. And you couldn't justifiably say that you have fallible knowledge of this infallible claim.
Yeah. How about set aside God for the moment and consider something else? 1 + 1 = 2. So that's infallible, certainly, because 1 + 1 = 2 is understood to be necessarily true. And certainly, if you're a Platonist, a realist about numbers, then you believe that those numbers themselves that are described in that equation are necessarily existent. They could not fail to exist, and that thus the relationships between 1, 1, and 2 described in that equation is necessarily true. So that would seem to be the very epitome of necessary and infallible knowledge of infallible, necessarily existent entities. But you're saying you couldn't even have fallible knowledge that 1 + 1 = 2. Is that correct?
Well, no, I'm saying you could have fallible knowledge 1 + 1 = 2. You couldn't have infallible knowledge of 1 + 1 = 2. Like, from my personal perspective, is that I grant Descartes' evil demon argument. I say 1 + 1 = 2 could be just a delusion in our brains in some way, and there could be a 1 + 1 = 3 out there in some sense that we just can't comprehend. But I would be willing. I'm happy to grant that math and logic are metaphysical absolutes for the sake of argument.
Okay, so you can have fallible knowledge that 1 + 1 = 2, but you can't have fallible knowledge that there is a necessarily existent creator who brought the universe into existence.
Yes, I would grant that.
I just don't see the difference there.
Between
that you can have fallible knowledge of what you call an infallible property, but which I've suggested we ought to instead describe as necessarily existent, or essential property, or necessarily existent entity, that you can't have fallible knowledge of that when it's God, but you can when it's a mathematical equation or a Platonic number. And I'm wondering why you make that distinction. I still don't understand that.
Well, again, I don't. I still say that those things, you can't have fallible knowledge of those. Those aren't infallible. I say that math is purely conceptual. It's something in our heads, like language. So I don't say those are necessarily true. I say those are contingently true. But if I'm going to grant for the sake of argument that math and logic are necessarily true, I would say they're true simply by definition or something. There is no definition about existence that requires it to have been created by anything.
So you're saying mathematical equations are analytic truths rather than synthetic a priori truths?
Essentially, yeah.
Okay, one of the problems with that is that it would seem, if that were true, if that were in fact correct, then you could know an equation without knowing the sum total of the equation. I mean, that if you knew the one, you should know automatically the other. And that is because in the same way, for example, let me give you another example. If you understand what it means to be a bachelor, then you know that a bachelor is an unmarried male. Likewise, that's because all bachelors and unmarried male is an analytic truth. So you could say truth by definition. If mathematical equations were analytic truths by definition in that trivial sense, then to know the first part of an equation, the numbers being added up, would be to know the sum total of it automatically, because you would already know it, because it's an analytic trivial truth. And yet the fact is that we actually have to work out our equations. So if, for example, I said to you, well, what's 345 multiplied by 272? You need to get a calculator and work that out. You don't automatically know the equation, the conclusion, the sum total of it. And that's because it's not an analytic truth. It's in fact what philosophers call a synthetic a priori truth.
Right, but I wouldn't consider any significant distinction there because it's simply a translation tool. You're using a translation to go from the multiplication process to what it translates into. It's kind of like looking at a Japanese word and you have to, well, how do you translate this to English? They are by definition the same thing. You just have to find a dictionary because you don't know them in your head.
Except that you're not translating here. So I think the analogy breaks down there, that we're not translating a word from Japanese like arigato into English, thank you. What we're doing is working on an equation, and the fact is that if it were an analytic truth, then you would automatically know the conclusion in virtue of knowing the sum, the parts that form the conclusion. And in fact, we don't know that, the numerators and denominators.
Well, I'd consider that the same as a translation.
Okay. Oh, so let's then swing back to God, maybe. Now, sorry, you're saying that this is a special problem for making claims about all necessarily existent beings. I mean, you've said infallible properties, but I suggest you ought instead speak about necessarily existent entities. But it's so are you saying, like, what is the actual target of your skepticism here? Is it necessarily existent entities?
Yeah.
Okay, so anything that you say exists of necessity, we cannot know with fallible knowledge that it exists.
Yeah.
Or have any beliefs about it.
Yeah, it sounds good.
Okay, now you gave an example earlier from the law of excluded middle that you either exist or do not exist. Now that would seem to be necessarily true.
Right.
So that is necessarily describing a state of affairs, a macro state of affairs, that either you exist or do not exist. But it would seem that that is actually the epitome of knowledge. But if you're correct, then you cannot even know that fallibly.
Well, no, I'd go further than that. I'd say you can know one or the other. Either I exist or I don't exist. But if you want to say I do exist or I do not exist, one of those two, you pick one. That's the part that's unsupported. So I grant that there has to be a necessary something. But if you want to say something about that something, the necessary thing, that's the unsupported part.
Well, so what I'm just saying is that it is true, giving a truth statement, it is true that either you exist or you do not exist. That is, if that's true, and that is necessarily true, then that would seem to be the epitome of infallible knowledge. But from what you've been saying, we can't have infallible knowledge of such things. In fact, we can't even have fallible knowledge of such things.
Well, no, I grant that there are certain things that we can't have fallible knowledge of infallible things, like I think, therefore I am. So I can grant that, and I'm happy to grant math and logic, even though I personally don't. So if you want, I'm okay with those. Though they're not the same, because those are true. Those they couldn't be otherwise. They're incorrigible, like what you said. Whereas statements about what this necessary thing are not incorrigible.
Yeah.
Kind of like if I said I exist, that's not incorrigible because I could not exist.
Because it's possible that you might not exist. So we can maybe come back to what I've been trying to do here, which is to build up a richer and richer concept of God that you have been willing to concede. So thus far, you've been willing to concede, well, it is possible to know that there is, to have fallible knowledge of the existence of an intelligence that created the universe and responds to prayers and has an immutable character. And I would all say already at that point, you were at a minimal conception of God. So,
well, I'd say none of those actually have anything to do with the necessary existence. Those could all just be like an alien. There could be an alien that created the universe, and an alien that answers your prayers, and an alien that has an immutable character. So none of those get you to the noumenal or the necessary existence qualities.
Well, I haven't talked about God's necessary existence thus, right? I've simply talked about a creator of the universe who answers my prayers, who has an immutable moral character.
Right. So my only argument right now is against the necessary parts. That's the necessary properties. All of the other properties I'd have different arguments against. Right now, argument I just presented is just against the necessary stuff.
Yeah. So I'm pointing out. So we can have fallible knowledge of a being to that level. Now, what about having knowledge that being sent his son into the universe 2,000 years ago to become human? And to take on a human nature while retaining a divine nature, and to die and rise for the sins of human beings. In principle, can a person have fallible knowledge of that?
Sure.
Okay, so right there, that you've already conceded really sort of the essence, the heart or core of Christian belief. So I'd say that's pretty good for a day's exchange.
Well, again, so there's two arguments here. One, the first half of my epistemology is just saying we can't get to the noumenal stuff, the necessary stuff. The second half of my epistemology is going through all of the individual claims, like did Jesus rise from the dead? Do the arguments for an intelligent creator exist? And I reject all of those also. So I would reject those based on the second half of my epistemology, but I haven't presented that.
Yeah, but this first part of your epistemology is fully congruent with a person having knowledge of basic Christian doctrine.
Yes.
Now, you did say, when you refer back to the noumenal realm, and again, I prefer just to say reality as it is, but then you said noumenal realm and you said necessary.
Well, yeah, I thought that's what you said. You said instead of saying noumenal, you were supposed to say the necessary existence.
Well, no. So as I said, when I talk about noumenal reality, or when Kant does, it's simply reality as it is, apart from our knowing or our mental structures. So, I'm willing to just at this point say, okay, I think I've gotten pretty far in this conversation. I'd like to maybe shift over, if you don't mind, and to probe a little bit more on your basic assumptions as to what knowledge is. So how do you define knowledge and some of these other questions like justified true belief, rationality? How do you define those? Because the way you define those concepts provides the framework in which your subsequent epistemology is developed, right? So it's important to have clear definitions of what those concepts are. So knowledge. How do you define knowledge?
Just a fact that corresponds to reality or something like that.
Okay. Well, of course, there's no mention of a knower in there. So, and I would say a fact corresponding to reality. The problem with that is that that's trivial, because by definition, a fact is a true statement or one that corresponds to reality. So the first thing you'd want to have in your definition of knowledge, in addition to facts, is a knower. So a person who believes the fact. So for it to be knowledge would be for you to believe the fact. But it would seem you'd also need something more than belief in the fact, because there are many things we can believe that turn out to be true. They turn out to be facts, but nonetheless, we might stumble upon that true belief or knowledge, by happenstance. So, for example, let's say
Gettier problems.
Well, not even Gettier problems. This is before you get to Gettier problems, but that's a higher level discussion. But this is even, like I'm just saying, even if you have, say, well, knowledge is true belief. Well, no, it's not just that, because you could believe something for not good reasons. Right. So let's say, for example, Donald Trump, I suppose, says true things every once in a while. And if you just believe everything Donald Trump says, and you happen to believe something he says that is in fact true, it wouldn't follow necessarily that you know it, because Donald Trump is known to be generally unreliable when it comes to relaying the truth. And so you actually should not have believed that based upon the larger framework of his general unreliability. And so you would not know it even though it were a true belief. And that's not even at the level yet of Gettier problems. So you would want to have, at the very least, some justification, which that person wouldn't have if they just believe everything Donald Trump says uncritically. You'd want to have the true belief, and you'd also want to have justification. Now, you mentioned Gettier problems. Gettier problems arise in the circumstances where you can actually have true belief and justification and still have something that it would seem you do not know. And so, for example, a simple example, Bertrand Russell actually gave this example 30 years before Edmund Gettier wrote his famous paper in 1963. Russell says, and he didn't actually appreciate that this was a big problem at the time, but he says, you're walking along and you look at the town clock and it says 3:20, and it is in fact 3:20. So you're justified in believing it, and it is in fact true. Do you know it? Well, what if the clock broke 12 hours ago at 3:20 a.m. and is just now giving that time, and you happen to look up and see? So you have met justification and true belief, but it still seems that you do not know it. And that's why philosophers have been saying we need to have something more than justification and true belief in order to define knowledge. And that's where I would come in myself. I'm deeply influenced by the Plantingan approach to say, I think it's important to have an externalist approach to knowledge. And I would understand that in terms of proper function, but I would want to know how you would understand it.
Right. So my epistemology addresses the problem by classifying knowledge into three groups. You have conceptual knowledge, empirical knowledge, and metaphysical knowledge. Each one has a different level of justification to make it reasonable to believe. So conceptual knowledge is anything you think. If you think it, that's conceptual knowledge. You're justified in believing it just because you thought it. Empirical knowledge is knowledge that's knowledge about the world, like an externalist view of knowledge, where there's something existing in the world. And in order to be justified in believing empirical knowledge, you need to have empirical evidence, or it needs to be verified in some scientific kind of a way. And then there's metaphysical knowledge. Metaphysical knowledge is the kind of noumenal, absolute, necessary, reality as it really is kind of a thing. And in order to be justified in those, there is no way, essentially, that I know of, except for I think, therefore I am. There's no justification for those kinds of knowledge.
Okay, so you talked about three different kinds of knowledge as you understand it, but you haven't given a core definition of knowledge. So I assume that there is a core conceptual framework shared by those three examples of knowledge. And so what, for you, is that core conceptual shared content of knowledge that is shared by these three forms of knowledge?
Probably like a correspondence between the claim and the justification for the claim, something like that.
Okay, well, so you're saying, in essence, justified true belief?
But it's more than that. It's justified true belief that has a correspondence between the justification and the claim. So they have to be the same kind of a thing.
Well,
that could all fit into the classification of justification if you want.
So are you an internalist about knowledge?
Yeah, knowledge is just something we have to believe. So knowledge is a belief in our heads, and whether or not that belief corresponds to existing things or true things in reality outside of our head.
Like, are you familiar with internalism and externalism, that distinction?
Yeah, where internalism is the stuff in our head and imagination, and externalism is the stuff outside of us and what exists in reality.
Somewhat. So the core idea here is, for internalism, you need to have internal awareness of your reasons or grounds or evidence for a belief in order to be justified in holding that belief. For externalism, there are at least some subset of knowledge in which you do not have to be aware of the underlying evidence or justification for that belief in order to have justified belief or to have knowledge. And so I'm an externalist, and I'm wondering if you're an externalist or an internalist.
Yeah, I'd be externalist in the sense that they're both. There are both kinds. Things that are justified just by knowing them internally, and things that are justified by having an external source.
Okay, so let's, for example, if Christianity is true, or something like Christianity is true, and God speaks to people and reveals himself to people through means like prayer, then there's no problem in principle with God communicating directly to a person. And all things being equal, again, we're talking fallible knowledge here. It's fallible. It's defeasible. You could be wrong. But all things being equal, in the same way that you can communicate to me and share something of your will that you want me to do, God can communicate directly to a person and communicate something of what God wants them to do. And in both cases, I am justified prima facie in accepting that you have expressed your will to me, or that God has expressed God's will to me. And so there's no epistemological problem with that, even if I don't have any greater understanding, justification of how something works, but I can know that much and still have justified externalist knowledge. You're okay with that?
No, I would reject that. I would say that you have internalist knowledge of the God, but to have externalist knowledge, you need to have some other basis. Like, the reason it's reasonable to believe that you conveyed your will to me is because on top of my conceptual or internalist evidence that I can understand it, I have externalist evidence of all of the empirical scientific stuff of humans and biology and chemistry and neurology and the fact that people exist and people talk and all these other things. So I can combine those two and give a justified, both internalist from the fact I understand it and externalist view that you exist. But you can't do that for God. You only have the internalist view, which only justifies the internalist conclusion that God's in your head, from my view.
Let's maybe back up. How do you is your belief that you're talking to another mind that is to me, and you're not the only mind that exists? So solipsism is false. Is that a belief that you hold? Because I assume you hold it.
Yes.
Is that a belief that you hold externalistically or internalistically?
Both. I have the internalist.
Well, it can't be both. It can't be both.
Well, remember, there's different kinds of knowledge can be justified some can be justified internally and some can be justified externally. So,
yes. So the question is, do you need to have evidence and arguments for the falsity of solipsism in order to be justified in believing that solipsism is false?
yes.
If so, yes, you do.
Yes, from my viewpoint, by using like a scientific verification that meets the criteria of what I qualify externalist justification. So I'm justified in believing that you exist because I have the scientific evidence that there are other people and how computers work and how signals work and how.
Okay. So, first of all, that would follow from that. I'm assuming that you do have that arguments all in place. That would nonetheless imply that the vast majority of people on Earth who clearly don't have access to all that evidence that you've just referenced, they are not justified in believing that there are minds other than their own. And so one thing I would say is that that's an implausible conclusion, that we should actually be a little bit skeptical of developing epistemologies that have very implausible consequences, such as that the vast majority of people on Earth are not justified in believing other minds exist. But I'd also want to come to a second point. And that brings us back to something that you've referenced earlier in this exchange, and that was the idea of underdetermination. So I would wonder, why don't you face a problem of underdetermination here? So for people watching that maybe have forgotten what that is, underdetermination applies. You gave an example, a nice example of having a box and it weighs 2 pounds and you conclude that there's a rabbit in there, but it's possible, that's consistent with many other things being in the box and it weighing 2 pounds. And so we're not justified in believing that there's a rabbit in there. By the same token, it would seem that all the evidence that you've cited from science is fully compatible with you being the only mind that exists and you having generated all the sensory experiences that you're now interpreting as science. And so how would you get beyond that to have an adequate argument to justify your belief in other minds internalistically in the way that you've deemed necessary?
All right, so your first question was, do other people who don't have the information I list, are they justified in believing there's other minds? I would say yes, because they do have experience of other people. And the experience of the other people is them having the same properties that you have. And if they have those properties, you can label things that have these properties are things that have minds. So that's the internalist justification. If it meets this set of internalist criteria, it is defined as a mind. And those criteria, of course, are external things. So we have the internalist definition of what qualifies as a mind, plus the externalist verification of does it have these properties. We put those together, we have yes, it's justified to have a mind. But then we have the problem of underdetermination. They could all be philosophical zombies. So your second question is, with underdetermination, do I face it? Yes. Can I solve it? No. But I don't need to, because my claim isn't of the infallible kind. If it was of the infallible kind, then it would be an unjustified claim for me to make any of those. But because I'm making a claim that isn't of the infallible kind, I'm only making the claim that it meets my definition of what I call this thing, then I don't need to be able to solve the problem of underdetermination.
Okay, so I'll leave aside your first point, although it's an interesting response. That, well, maybe I won't leave it aside. I'll say a little bit about it. So the first point being that average person is justified in believing that there are minds other than themselves because these other things that they're coming into encounter with are sufficiently like them. Okay, one thing I would want to say, though, is that you'd still have to say that people go through a process of reasoning, that they reason. This sensory experience that I'm experiencing, which I'm calling mom, seems to be adequately like me, and I am conscious, so I can thereby infer that this sensory experience is in fact another conscious being. Hey, mom is conscious, yay! And so the first thing I'd want to say is I don't think that people actually do reason in the way that you've described. So even if I conceded that were open to them, that they could reason in that way, I don't think they do. And so they think they'd still be unjustified based upon your proposed model. And I think that it's actually quite different. I think that the vast majority of people don't go through a reasoning process in order to believe that there are other minds. I think rather they form those beliefs in a properly basic way, that they form it through a non-discursive means. In other words, they're not reasoning to a conclusion from premises. They just naturally form the belief that I'm interacting with another human being, that there's a mind other than my own. Now, the second point, So on the second point, though, I think to come back to you're saying, well, but I'm okay with having fallibilistic knowledge that solipsism is false, and I'm still a little bit at a loss as to understand why we can make grand metaphysical claims such as solipsism is false fallibilistically, but we can't make grand metaphysical claims such as theism is true fallibilistically.
All right, we can't. So I'm not saying solipsism is false metaphysically or in the sense, that kind of true sense. I'm saying that I define a mind as anything that has these properties. Now, I could be wrong. I don't care if I'm wrong. I'm just going to define anything that has these properties as a mind. Now, I'm not saying minds exist. I'm not saying solipsism is false. I'm not saying anything about the fundamental nature of reality. I'm just saying anything that has these properties, I personally define it as having a mind. So I'm not making those kinds of absolute claims. I'm only making a very tentative claim about my personal definition of how I define a mind.
Yeah, so I mean, certainly we all have to start somewhere. I mean, I think we all have a sense of basic understanding of a mind as having consciousness or sentience, self-awareness, the ability to act intentionally or with purpose, and so that's fine. And then we can form beliefs. I'm just saying, if we can have those fallibilistic justification to form beliefs about the ultimate nature of reality, what you've called the noumenal realm, what I've just said, let's just call ultimate reality or reality in itself, including solipsism is false. Why can't we likewise say fallibilistically theism is true?
Right, I agree with you. I agree with everything you just said. So I'm not saying solipsism is false. I cannot say that. I cannot justify the claim solipsism is false.
You can't justify that fallibilistically?
Right, no, I cannot justify that. All I can say is that I define minds this way. I don't know what the fundamental nature of reality is. I could be the only mind, but that level of a description of reality itself or ultimate reality isn't something I'm saying. I'm not making any claims about ultimate reality. I'm only making a claim about the apparent reality that I experience. In the apparent reality I experience, I can say that there are other minds or things I define as other minds, but I've made no claim about reality itself. My statement does not extend into reality itself.
But why? So we're back now. So this is important to define knowledge. We're back to the definition of knowledge. If we've said that knowledge is having a true belief that is sort of grounded or perhaps in some cases justified. So, I mean, it doesn't all have to be justified in the sense of evidential justification if you're an externalist, but grounded or justified and true knowledge or true belief. If that's what knowledge is, I certainly don't understand why you cannot have knowledge, fallible knowledge perhaps, but knowledge nonetheless that solipsism is false. One of the things we want to come back to here is sort of this, maybe back to Rene Descartes. So when Rene Descartes, he wants to, in his own day, defeat the skeptics, he begins by assuming a principle of skepticism even more radical than the skeptics of his day, and says he will doubt everything, even doubt that he exists, and see what I can come up with. So the problem there, I think, with the Cartesian method, such as it's been given to us, is that it sets up reasoned thought and rationality as a one-sided affair, that it is about exercising doubt and skepticism. But as Anthony Kenny famously, I think should be more famous, pointed out, that in fact rationality is the golden mean, sort of the Aristotelian virtue that finds the balance between excessive skepticism and excessive credulity. So you can indeed be too credulous and believe too much and be unjustified, but you can likewise be too skeptical and be unjustified in your skepticism, and that is as much a problem as excessive credulity. And so I would wonder why when you are unwilling to say that you can even know that there is a mind other than your own that exists, why you are not being unduly skeptical and thus not rational in the way that someone like Anthony Kenny would describe, because of your excessive skepticism of your own cognitive faculties.
Right. That goes back to where I defined my my definition of knowledge, where there's 3 tiers of knowledge: the conceptual, empirical, metaphysical. Mm-hmm. Making those metaphysical claims about what reality is really like, those are all unsupported. We can't justify those. But we can still have empirical knowledge, the kind of fallibilistic knowledge that you were talking about of the phenomenal world of the world as we experience it. And we can define those things perfectly well. We can have perfect knowledge of those things, of the world as we experience it. The only thing we can't have is knowledge of reality as itself. So I make a distinction between those two and say we can have empirical knowledge of the world, and I can have empirical knowledge of other minds, and I can have empirical knowledge of Australia existing, but I can't have any metaphysical knowledge of those things. The metaphysical category is out. That's the reality as it is category.
I'm a little puzzled why we can't have fallible knowledge of ultimate reality. Because I come back to I look out the window. It seems to be sunny outside. Assuming I have no defeaters, that it is sunny outside. Why cannot I be justified in believing it is sunny outside? And if it is in fact sunny outside, then I have knowledge that it is sunny outside.
Right, because I'd say that everything you just experienced was a description of the phenomenal or the world as we experience it, and that is a description of the reality that we experience. But the description of the reality we experience has no necessary correlation to the description of reality as it is. Those are two separate categories. So I still think reality as we experience it is reality. I call that reality, but it's not the same as the fundamental reality as it is kind of a thing. Those are two separate categories. So you'd be justified in saying, I can understand reality as I experience it, or the reality we experience this way. And that's justified. But you would not be justified to extend from that to reality, the fundamental reality as it is like this.
Well, when you connected just now, a reality as I experience it with reality as it is, and said there's no necessary connection. Now, I would assume that by saying there's no necessary connection, that's a way of tracking on to what I earlier described as no indefeasible knowledge or incorrigible knowledge or certain knowledge about which you could not possibly be wrong. But of course, if you are a fallibilist in your epistemology, then you don't require there to be a necessary connection between your experience of reality and reality as it is. We can have fallible knowledge such that we could be wrong, but it is still knowledge. So yes, it is possible that I'm sleeping right now. I mean, I've had some very vivid dreams in which I thought I was awake, but nonetheless, it seems to me I'm awake, and all things being equal, when I look out the window, I think I'm justified in believing I am awake and that it is in fact sunny outside in reality and not simply in my dream. So I think that what we're really bumping up to here is not so much an objection against God per se, but it seems to me that there is I'm going to put it a little provocatively, a lingering hangover of Cartesian angst that we want to continue to hold on to the demand, the expectation, the assumption that for knowledge to be worthwhile, knowledge has to be certain, infallible, incorrigible, and indefeasible. And I'm saying we don't need to have that. We can have knowledge of the world as it seems to us from our perspective, and that's good enough. And in fact, I think that that's what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, where he says we see darkly as through a glass. I think that adequately describes our epistemological situation as knowing human beings.
Right. So from my perspective, in order to describe reality as itself, even in a fallible sense, we need some kind of a probability, some kind of a numerator and a denominator in order to establish what is the likelihood that what we're experiencing is or is not a description of reality in itself. And from my perspective, there is no denominator for that equation. There's nothing we have that gives us access to anything in that reality as itself kind of category that can give us a denominator, that can give us even a percentage point of probability of whether or not what we're experiencing is a description of that reality in itself. So we should just abandon that completely and just say reality is a model or a caricature that we can understand through phenomenal or through reality as we experience it means. And we should build reality from the bottom up in this kind of a way and just say, this is as far as we can know, or this is as far as we can build a model of reality. But this model of reality has no real correlation or necessary correlation to what reality is really, really like. So, because for example, in discoveries in physics, most of the stuff we experience is wrong. Like if we hold an object, hold a glass, and we think it's a solid object, 99% of it is empty space. We see colors, but colors don't actually exist. They're just a product of our mind because of different wavelengths of light. Most of the reality we experience doesn't exist or does not correspond to the way reality actually is. It's a caricature.
Oh, so you said the objection as you raised it was in terms of probability, that if we are going to have this knowledge of the things in itself, the noumenal realm, reality, that we need to be able to identify the probability that we are in fact gaining that knowledge. So that very principle, I would ask, what's the probability of that principle? If you've already said you accept it because you've appealed to it, so what is the probability of that principle itself being true? And if you don't have that probability, then you've just undercut the very principle that you're appealing to.
What do you mean true? Is it, how would it be?
Well,
like, it's not a true-false statement, true-false question, I don't think.
well, if you said in order to have knowledge of reality or the noumenal realm, we need to be able to calculate the probability that our knowledge or our beliefs match up to that reality and in fact accurately describe it. And I said, well, that itself is a principle which you believe because you just appealed to it. And so I said, okay, then that principle must apply to itself. So what is that probability of the principle itself being true? And if you don't have that probability, then why do you accept it? Because it's self-defeating.
Well, we both accept there's a difference between the noumenal and the phenomenal, or the reality as we experience it and reality as it is. We already know those are not the same thing.
Yeah.
So the question is we need some way to bridge the gap on those two. Now, and probability is just the way to do that. Either we can do it at 100% and get it with the absolute infallible knowledge, or we can do it with 0% and have no correlation, or somewhere in between. Those are the only logical possibilities. So,
well, I'm denying that altogether. I don't think that you need to do a probability assessment or to know that it is sunny outside. I think you can look out and see that it is sunny outside. And this is because in my epistemology, we have a prima facie, now that means in other words at face value, you accept the deliverances of your cognitive faculties unless you have some reason to deny them. And thus there is no probability requirement to do. And so, yes, you can reasonably deny what you've just proposed. So you can't accept it as just a first principle. It is, in fact, a contentious philosophical or epistemological claim. And one of the reasons I think it's a contentious claim is because it undercuts itself, because you haven't provided a probability assessment of the probability principle. And thus, I think you're unjustified to accept it as the one necessary means to build a bridge between the world as we know it or experience it and the world as it is.
Well, Bayesian epistemology just says that you use your properly basic belief as a justification to move it over the 50% mark. So in Bayesian epistemology, everything is just probabilities. That's just how it is. There isn't an option B. So I don't know. So that would fit into the probabilities category. I don't know.
No, it really doesn't. I mean, I'm not making a probability assessment and saying it is 50%, 50 plus 1% likely that it is sunny out today. Probability assessments don't even enter into the process by which I form that belief.
Right.
And the vast majority of our beliefs are not probability assessments.
Right, but we can assess those in the framework as a probability statement. So we can translate your belief as to if it's above 50, you believe. If it's below 50, you don't believe. That's not you doing the probability assessment. That's just me looking at your belief and justification and putting that into a probability language. So it's not entailed that we need the probability thing. It's just we need a reason to go above the 50% mark.
Okay, and what's your reason for going above the 50% mark on the probability principle itself as the means to draw the connection between the world as we experience it and the world as it is?
Because it's logically necessary. The option is either the 0%, 100%, or something in between. It's for everything. Probability, Bayesian epistemology, everything is just a probability. There isn't an option B. It's logically necessary. It's just a language.
Yeah, it's just not true. I have to say, I'm conceding that you can go back and translate my beliefs or my actions with respect to numerical values. But the issue here is the claim that one must do a probability assessment in order to justify one's beliefs about reality in itself.
You're right. I agree. You don't have to do a probability assessment. That wasn't the point I was making. The point I was making is that you need to have some reason to believe that your experience of the world corresponds to reality as it is, and your justification was your properly basic belief. So you have something, and then I would classify that as something that moves the dial higher than the 50% on the probability scale. So my argument is that you need some reason to believe that your experience of the world corresponds to reality as it is, and you said your reason is your properly basic belief.
I didn't say my reason is my properly basic belief, because it's not a process of reasoning in many cases. Rather, what it is when you form beliefs and your cognitive faculties are functioning properly in their appropriate epistemic environment, then all things being equal, unless you have some undercutting defeater or reason to reject or question the reliability of your cognitive faculties, you're justified in accepting their deliverances. And that would include, for example, looking out the window and seeing that it is a sunny day right now, and I form the belief that it is a sunny day, and I'm justified in doing so. I have a reasonable belief, and if it is in fact sunny, I can know that it is sunny, even though I haven't done any probability assessment, so that we can have knowledge of reality in itself.
Right, and I reject properly basic beliefs because I think they're silly. I think that we can prove they're wrong sufficiently amount of time that they're not justifiable for anything. It's just like saying our intuition. We have intuition that something is true. Intuition fails enough that intuition is not a description that has no correlation, as far as we can tell, with reality as it is. It is purely a construction of our mind. So I would say that our properly basic beliefs are similarly just purely a construction of our minds. There is no correlation to reality as it is, and it undercuts all of Plantinga's properly basic arguments. Like, no. That from my perspective.
Wow. Yeah. So it hurts me right here to hear that not only the epistemology I hold, but probably I think the majority of epistemology today, which is a moderate foundationalism, is actually silly. Because moderate foundationalism, which is, I think, the most commonly held theory of noetic structure among epistemologists today, when distinguishes between properly basic beliefs and properly non-basic beliefs, it's tough to hear that that's in fact silly. I have a
phone call.
Not a phone call, but it sounds like an emergency alert. So we have a warning system, like when there's something. I'm going to be okay, though. Don't worry.
Oh, okay. So yeah,
what is your theory of noetic structure? Are you a pragmatist about noetic structure? Are you a coherentist, or what is your view?
Probably a coherentist, but I wanted to pick up on that word because on reading the philosophical literature, properly basic beliefs, Plantinga's version specifically has been heavily criticized as being arbitrary. It applies to anything you want. It doesn't work. So I'm pretty sure, even though some form of properly basic belief may be accepted in philosophy, Plantinga's isn't it. Because one of the things is like the voodoo argument or the Great Pumpkin argument from Michael Ruse, where we say that whatever... It seems that based on Plantinga's definition, you can apply properly basic belief to any belief held by a society, decided by the society to be a properly basic belief.
Okay, so maybe we should. I only have a couple minutes left, but I want to say that there is here as grounds for further discussion. That there is a distinction epistemologists make between these two different approaches: Methodism and particularism. And so Methodism is the approach where we begin by stipulating a priori what has to be the case in order for a belief to be rational, knowledge, or justified. Particularism begins rather by asking the question, how do people normatively form beliefs, and using that as an innocent until proven guilty approach to justification and even knowledge. So for example, and you can work through these. So we do...
Roger Chisholm, problem with the criterion, right?
Yeah. So Roderick Chisholm was a well-known philosopher who talked about this. You're right. So for example, we would go and we would look at, sense perception is one that I've appealed to several times in this exchange. That's a common way we form beliefs, basically through sense perception, through our memory. So we regularly appeal to our memory as absent until proven guilty. We regularly appeal to the testimony of others. So I trust what people say unless I have some reason not to. And I gave an example of Donald Trump being someone who is not someone you should be appealing to. Moral intuition, that's another example. Rational intuition, that's another example. And so right there, you would already have a core set of claims that would justify a moderate foundationalist epistemology. And in fact, I would say just from what I've described thus far, you wouldn't need to appeal to anything further that Plantinga talks about. He talks about the sensus divinitatis, or also what he calls the internal instigation of the Holy Spirit, which is, I don't have any problem with that. I mean, those are what I think are relative to his framework that he would understand. But I would say you can, in fact, justify Christian claims with respect to those mundane sources, in particular testimony, and a broad understanding of what testimony is and how it functions. So that's not silly. And in fact, I don't even think that Plantinga's view is silly. I think that what his view is doing is articulating a moderate foundationalist Christian approach, moderate foundationalist approach with respect to Christian beliefs, which I think is a perfectly legitimate philosophical enterprise, just like an atheist or a naturalist seeks to articulate their epistemology relative to their background understanding framework of beliefs. So I'm going to let give over the closing or concluding statement to you.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I definitely don't mean his work is silly. I definitely appreciate his work. He definitely does a lot of really good philosophy. I just think that the properly basic belief, especially the sensus divinitatis, I think that just leads into the Cartesian circle, which is just the paradigmatic example of vicious circularity. So that's why I think it's silly. But yeah, I really appreciate you coming on. That was a really interesting conversation, and I would love to go into the first half of, or the second half of my epistemology, going through the is the testimony reasonable to believe in the claims of like the resurrection and stuff. That would be another interesting conversation to have.
Looking forward to it. I'm happy to do it, and very much I appreciate what you do, and I appreciate your demeanor. You know, that we always have good ironic exchanges, and I've seen you do the same with others. So I appreciate it, and thanks for having me on.
Thanks. Talk to you later.
Okay, take care.
Bye.